Well, I'm Whitfield Diffie, and we're talking about the era in the 1970s. I had no direct connection that I can recall with the rise of the internet other than as a user. I certainly was an early user of ARPANET. I didn't know much about how networks worked. I was interested in things that would turn out to be more network-centric than I understood at the time. My basic interest then was in building vastly more reliable and vastly larger programs than we could build at the time. So I came to Stanford because I was interested in what's mundanely called proof of correctness of programs, something that has basically gone nowhere. I mean, it's made a lot of progress, but not enough to get particularly close to being as broadly useful as we imagined at the time. So I had been working for MITRE, and I was supported by the MIT. I was supported by MITRE and quartered and given computers by the MIT AI lab, and I was working on symbolic mathematical manipulation and some supporting system programming. And in the process, I became convinced, and still am, that there was no more important problem in modern engineering than to give formal proofs that programs were correct. Okay. So John McCarthy was one of the few people in the world at the time who understood that, and I talked to him, and I came here to work at the AI lab at Stanford. I was rescued from that in the summer of 1972 by happenstance. Larry Roberts, who was funding the ARPANET, went to visit Howard Rosenblum, who was he was deputy director at NSA, but I don't know which one he was at the time. He was at different times both research and ComSec and maybe other things. But he went to talk to him about security of the ARPANET, because they had a $100 million a year military, prototype network research budget. He thought they ought to think about security. And they probably agreed about that, but they couldn't come to any further agreement because Roberts didn't want to support any secret work and Rosenblum didn't want to do anything else. So Roberts goes back to his office in Roslyn, right? And he's got a job where his PIs come through with their hats in their hands and they have to talk about whatever he wants to talk about. So that week he talked about network security. And as it happens, my boss, John McCarthy, came in there and he chatted him up about network security, and it's an interesting subject, got interested in it, came back out to the lab, talked to us about network security, and several people did some work on it. In particular, the man who's now head of the robot laboratory, machine intelligence laboratory, robotics laboratory at CMU. His name slips my mind at this instant. He implemented a cryptographic system that John McCarthy had designed, which is based on some instructions in the Russian Besom 6 computer that were put in there for cryptanalytic purposes. There are two instructions called either scatter and gather or spread and gather that use masks to either gather masked bits together or distribute them out to the places shown in the mask. And he wrote something that was later discovered at IBM called a shrinking generator. And this guy's Hans Moravec. So Hans Moravec was a graduate student. He had him implement it. Hans Moravec implemented something else later to become famous under the name key escrow. He thought, his advisor might encrypt something that was of interest to him. So he had the program stash the key somewhere he could find it in case he ever wanted to read any of John's traffic. So at any event, 6 months the other people who got interested in it worked on it for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. 6 months later, I was thinking about nothing else. We all thought at the time that network security meant cryptography. Right? We wouldn't think that now because the cryptographic piece has been solved and networks remain violently insecure. But at the time, the looming problem was cryptography, and I began working on that. And the spring of '73, John was fed up to his back teeth because I was being supported by under-the-table money from NSA to work on the proof of correctness problem. And he didn't think they'd be pleased to discover I was spending their money competing with them, because they didn't like that at all. So I just left, and I planned to travel around the world. But instead, I got as far as New Jersey and met my wife. And then we began traveling around the U.S. together. Right? I describe her, I call her my first discovery, without whom I would not have made any of the others. And we got back, let me see if I remember exactly. We came back here in the spring of '74, went away again during the summer, and went to one of the places we visited was IBM Yorktown Heights, which had the only significant non-government cryptographic laboratory in the country at the time. And the head of that group, Alan Conheim, died a couple of years ago, said, he only said one thing. Since then he wishes he hadn't said that. He said, we're under a secrecy order here. I can't tell you what we're doing, but you should go look up my old friend Marty Hellman, who was around here a couple of months ago, and I couldn't tell him anything either. But two people can work on a problem better than one. So we got back out here, and I called Marty, and he graciously granted me half an hour of his time, from 4:30 to 5 or something like that. And we were staying with Leslie Lamport, who just won the Turing Prize, up in Oakland. And we drove down, and Mary took the car off to go shopping or something, and I went to see Marty, and she called around 5:30. And Marty invited us to dinner, and all together we were together till 11 that night. We headed back to Berkeley, and it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We worked together for 4 years. We did a number of things. Particularly became a great pain in Alan Conheim's ample tush, because we started an argument about whether the crypto system that laboratory had initiated and in part designed should be adopted as it was as a national standard. So that's now my recollection of Vint. To be frank, my first recollection of him, though I probably met him earlier than that, is standing on the balcony of the Information Systems Laboratory, and I think he was talking to Marty, and I came up. I remember something like that. But the particular thing is that Vint would invite me to network security protocols meetings to be the cryptographer, because NSA wouldn't send anyone. Right. So I remember one or two such meetings at which I was there to know about the cryptographic issues and the way cryptography was used within these protocols. What more can I tell you?
How much was secret and how much was known, and how much was commercial and how much was private information? It seems like there's a blending of the line.
There's a fantastic line early on in a fantastic, best as a TV series called Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. Roddy Martindale says to Smiley, "But Control never had any secrets from you, did he, Smiley?" Smiley leans back in his chair and smiles and said, "That's the thing about secrets, Roddy. You never know." Now, to be clear, my impression, Vint may have another impression, you should ask him, but one, I was always an outsider with respect to NSA. And so, but my judgment at that time was that they, in fact, didn't know a lot about data networks. Right? That seemed to me they knew more about cryptography than the rest of us knew in the public world at that time. And they shot themselves in the foot because they were supporting all of the work on computer security, but they weren't willing to contribute any of their cryptographic techniques, okay? Because they thought they could keep the cryptography secret, and they thought they couldn't. They wanted to deploy computer security so widely that they couldn't keep it secret. So they didn't want, they had some secret projects of their own, like Blacker, that used cryptography for configuration control of the code. A very valuable idea, much better developed, almost as early in public techniques. But I never saw anything that they did in this respect that seemed particularly remarkable. But that doesn't mean you say, that's the thing about secrets. I don't know whether they knew something that I didn't know. There was not, networking was not the thing it is today. Very interesting thing for me was to be at the RSA Data Security Conference approximately 2000, let's say. You can figure out when it is. It was in San Jose, and it's the first year that it went from hundreds of people to thousands of people. And I walked in, and I thought, I knew this was important. I imagined millions of devices working, right? Trillions of bits moving. But I never understood how many people had to be hustling to turn a buck to make that happen. If I'd had that commercial insight, I would have been much better off. Right? And this was when it suddenly became a tremendous business. And the other thing has nothing to do with my history, but it's said about the RSA conference is there's a critical moment, and you can look this one up also, but it's about the same time, at which the big security conference on the West Coast was the Armed Forces Communications Electronics Association conference in San Diego. And NSA always had a big booth at that event. Right? And then suddenly they moved their attention to RSA, and they had a desk about the size of that table at AFCEA. And that really, I think, was a clear sign of the sudden shift of this technology from being government property to being primarily commercial. And at a level of bottom line, by still as early as the early 90s probably, the largest cryptographic systems, most widely deployed, were military. Whether you measure by number of devices, number of bits encrypted, or amount of money spent. But by 2000, they were just utterly dwarfed. SSL is probably the most widely deployed cryptographic security mechanism ever. Smart cards dwarf anything the military has ever done. Set-top boxes, when went from being crude analog computers to very sophisticated high-grade crypto systems, all of these things just dwarf any of the military deployments. And this is one part of something that has a major effect on military procurement because they no longer interest their suppliers. Right? We'll supply, so they won't go very far to do anything to customize for the military because that's just such a small fraction of their work.
So is it a fair statement to say that your work influenced e-commerce and everything going forward to have secure communications so that you could purchase things? And tell me a little bit.
I think it's a fair statement to say that public key cryptography enabled e-commerce. And that's something that's very close to what we had in mind to begin with. I did not have the imagination to see the web. I saw the problem, right? But I didn't have the foresight to see the solution. But what I imagined, my original motivation, I imagined 100 million secure telephones in North America. Right? We have never done that, right? But the techniques that were developed sort of toward that objective then became successful, being the security technique for the web. And the critical point was the loose coupling, right? That vendors and purchasers never have same interests. Well, they have some common interests, but basically they're always adversaries. And so you need something that requires less than the intimate relationship of knowing secrets before you start out working on something.
So as a final statement, how challenging is the security issue today to overcome? I mean, where are the holes? What do we need to develop? What do we need to together on?
I think the security problem today is a combination of some old and new things. Right? One critical one, you have to ask objectives that were formulated 40 years ago have yet to be solved. And in particular, there's something called the confinement problem, which is a very reasonable notion. We should be able to run a program and not have it hurt us. Right? And if you look at the RSA compromise 3 years ago, right, that is a perfect example of completely jackass approach to this whole matter. We have the nerve. This is an absolute scandal in my view. The security community dares to say to people, oh, you should be careful about what attachments you open. What in the world is wrong with them? You can't expect users to have any way of vetting the attachments that come in. They've got to be able to do their work. A reasonable-looking message comes in with an attachment. Why shouldn't you open it? Right? They've failed utterly to solve the problem of guaranteeing you can open the attachment and it's not going to hurt you any. Okay? So that's one direction. And the question is why? Right? And in my view, a significant part of the problem is lots of people want you to be secure against everyone except them. The government was very open about it at one point, but I think it's true of Apple and Google and Microsoft and Amazon and everybody else. And that makes the problem vastly more complicated, right? And it's not clear the essence of being able to certify security systems is simplicity. If you go complicate them with additional hidden access rules, you make everything a lot harder. So that's the best, I can come up with. It's very hard to explain how, Microsoft seems to have hired half the smart people in the field and yet not been able to solve the problem.